I watched the lagoon flatten against the reef, inches vanishing where the plan needed feet. I had warned them, and still the orders held, still the timetable marched on. When the boats grounded, I saw men step into deep water under machine gun fire, burdened and slow. On paper, and the reef kept its measure in bodies and lost gear. 20th of November, 1943, Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll in the Gilbert Islands. The United States is moving from the long fights of 1942 into a new phase of the Pacific War. The objective is a chain of small islands that can hold airfields, anchorages, and staging points. Operation Galvanic is the name given to the first major step into the Central Pacific. Tarawa is not large. Betio, the key island on the atoll's southwestern corner, is narrow and low. Its defences are dense, built for a fight at close range. Concrete emplacements, log bunkers, trenches, wire, and guns cover the approaches. The island is surrounded by a coral reef. Inside the reef is the lagoon, calm by comparison, but shallow where the coral rises. The operational situation is straightforward on paper. Warships will bombard, aircraft will strike. Landing craft will cross the lagoon, pass the reef, and put assault troops on beaches along the north shore. Once the foothold is established, follow-on waves will bring tanks, engineers, artillery, ammunition, and water. The beachhead will expand along the island until the defences collapse. The complication is also straightforward, but it is not always treated as such. The reef is not an obstacle that can be ignored. Whether a landing craft can cross it depends on the depth of water over the coral at the moment of landing. In this operation, a few inches are not a detail. A few inches decide whether the troops arrive inside their boats or outside them. In the planning rooms, tide information is incomplete. The atoll is not surveyed like a commercial harbour. There are charts, but not the kind made from years of soundings and local observation. There are tide tables, but tides in the Central Pacific are not uniform from island to island. In some places the range is small and the timing shifts. At Tarawa, there is also the reputation of a tide that does not behave as expected. Within the Marine Corps, engineers think in practical measurements. They ask how much water is needed to float a loaded boat. They ask what happens if it is not there. A Higgins boat, the common landing craft for infantry, can run up a beach, but it does not climb coral. To cross the reef, it needs depth. Planners identify a critical minimum, often cited at roughly 4 feet, to keep a laden Higgins boat moving over the reef. The assault plan relies on tracked amphibians, the LVTs, for the earliest waves. Those tractors can crawl across coral where boats cannot, but there are not enough of them to carry everyone. Most Marines will still ride in boats, tanks and many heavy weapons will still come by craft that prefer clear water. A single limitation becomes a system problem. In this system, a small group of men have a job that is not dramatic and rarely remembered. They are the ones who care about tides, depths, reefs and timings. They are not the commanders whose names appear in communiques. They are staff officers, technical advisors, surveymen and engineers. In the weeks before the assault, one such figure is attached to the planning effort. Major Frank Holland is a New Zealand reserve officer. He is not famous in the way combat leaders become famous. He is valued because he knows the waters. He has years of experience sailing around Tarawa. He understands the reef not as a diagram, but as a place with moods, wind effects, and water that can refuse to cooperate. His warning is blunt. He does not speak like a man trying to win an argument. He speaks like a man trying to prevent a predictable mistake. He tells planners that the depth over the reef may not reach what the boats require. He insists that the water will likely be less than expected when the first waves arrive. The phrasing survives in later accounts because it was so direct. The senior Marine planners do not treat him as background noise. Colonel David Shoup, responsible for the assault force, takes the warning seriously. He cannot change the reef. He cannot manufacture a larger tide. What he can do is prepare Marines for the possibility that they will have to wade. He ensures the risk is discussed, not hidden behind optimism. There is tension between what reality suggests and what the timetable demands. In amphibious doctrine, the timetable is often presented as discipline. It keeps ships, waves, and fires coordinated. It keeps the force moving in one rhythm. But a timetable cannot create water. It can only assume it will be there. At the fleet level, the operation is driven by broader constraints. Surprise is valued. Time on station is limited by the fear of enemy naval reaction. The preliminary bombardment is restricted in duration compared with what some Marine leaders want. The landing is scheduled within a narrow window. The tide becomes one factor among many, and not always the one that wins. As the assault date approaches, the reef stays where it has always been. The Japanese garrison improves firing positions and strengthens wire and obstacles. Guns are sighted to cover the lagoon approaches and the likely beaches. Bunkers are arranged so that one can support another. The defenders intend to catch assault troops at their most vulnerable point, the moment they are exposed, crowded, and unable to maneuver. The men who worry about tides know exactly what that moment looks like. A boat that grounds on coral is not merely delayed. It becomes a target that cannot evade. It becomes a traffic jam behind it. It forces men into the water, and water steals speed, footing, and control. If the men are carrying radios, demolition charges, ammunition, or machine guns, water can steal those too. The reef does not need to kill anyone directly to shape the day. On the night before the landing, the task force approaches the atoll. Ships are arranged by assignment. Transports prepare to lower boats. Commanders review the sequence one last time. Somewhere within that controlled movement, a minor uncertainty remains. It is not the kind that appears on maps. It appears in tide predictions that might be off by inches or by more. At dawn on 20th of November, naval gunfire begins. The lagoon is lit by flashes. Shells strike Betio and throw coral sand and smoke into the air. An aircraft add their own pattern of attacks. From a distance, this looks like the standard opening of amphibious war. From closer in, details matter. The first waves climb down nets into small craft. The motion is practiced, but the water is never still enough to make it easy. Equipment clanks and scrapes. Men settle into the bottoms of boats with rifles protected against spray. Coxswains watch headings and spacing. The boats form up and begin moving toward the line of departure. Major Holland is not at the front of a wave. His work is not to fire a rifle. His contribution happens in quiet warnings, in measurements, in timing. He has already said what he believes will happen. Now the operation will test whether the system listened enough. The assault begins to move across the lagoon. Tracked amphibians push through the water. Engines loud, carrying Marines who will be first onto the island. Behind them come Higgins boats with more infantry. Farther back are craft with heavier loads. The formation lengthens as the distance closes. As the craft near the reef, the lagoon reveals its depth. The water is not the depth planners hoped would be present. In places, the reef shows itself through pale breaks in the surface. The tractors continue, scraping and climbing, doing what they were built to do. The boats do not. Higgins' boats begin to stop. Their hulls meet coral and refuse to move forward. Some lift and settle as waves pass, but they do not gain ground. Coxswains try for channels that are supposed to exist. They find water that is still too shallow. A craft that grounds becomes an obstruction to the craft behind it. In the early minutes, men look for this to be temporary. They expect the tide to rise as predicted and float them over. But the time is wrong for waiting. Enemy fire is already reaching into the lagoon. Machine gun bullets strike water and throw small bursts upward. Larger rounds hit the sides of craft with dull, frightening impacts. Mortars begin to find the crowded approaches. The lagoon becomes a place where men are exposed without cover. The grounding forces a decision that should have been optional. Marines step into water that can be waist-deep or deeper, depending on the man and the exact point. They begin moving towards the beach, burdened by packs, ammunition, and weapons. The distance is not a few yards. It can be several hundred. In later descriptions, it's often summarized in round numbers, but the reality is measured in time under fire. Some men make progress by stumbling from coral head to coral head. Others find holes where the reef drops unexpectedly. A man who falls can lose his rifle or his footing. A man who loses his footing can lose his life when he is carrying weight. The surf is not large, but it is enough to push a man sideways when he is already struggling. The landing craft that grounded under enemy guns becomes a symbol, not because it is unique, but because there are many like it. Some are riddled, some pull back if they can, some cannot move at all, some are hit while they are waiting for water that will not arrive. The Japanese do not need to guess what is happening. They can see it. They have planned for it. Their guns are sighted to fire along the reef edge and across the open lagoon approaches. They fire into a mass of men who cannot sprint, cannot disperse, and cannot take cover. On the beach, the first Marines who reach the seawall discover that even arrival is not safety. The beach is narrow. The seawall offers limited protection, but it also confines movement. Fire comes from bunkers, from enfilading positions, from places that cannot be silenced quickly. The men who are pinned down can do little for the men still in the water behind them. Engineers are among those trying to move forward. Their tasks include clearing wire, breaching obstacles, and opening paths for tanks and supplies. But engineering in an assault is not done in a workshop. It is done with hands shaking from exertion, with tools wet from salt water, and with explosives that must be kept functional despite immersion. As the morning continues, the assault loses the simple rhythm planned for it. When a plan assumes that most troops will ride to the beach inside boats, it allocates time accordingly. When the troops instead wait for long distances, the schedule breaks apart. Boat waves arrive out of sequence. Some units land where they did not intend. Communications degrade because radios are soaked or lost. A battalion that should have landed together arrives in fragments. The operational problem becomes cumulative. The Reef delays heavy weapons and reserves. The Reef keeps tanks from landing where they are needed. The Reef forces ammunition to be carried by hand across exposed water. The Reef becomes the central fact of the day. There is also a separate failure that grows from the same cause. The supply flow, even in a successful landing, depends on craft going back and forth. When craft are damaged on the Reef, their ability to shuttle men and supplies collapses. The tracked amphibians that can cross are not immune to damage. Many are holed and disabled. The few that continue must choose between carrying men in and carrying wounded out, between ammunition and water. In this chaos, the warning about tides is no longer a theoretical argument. It is a description of the current moment. It is a prediction turning into a visible condition. Major Holland's role is not to say that he was right. His role is to help those around him understand what can still be done within that condition. Tides do not rise on command, but they do have a schedule, however imperfectly predicted. Local observation can sometimes tell whether the water is rising enough to matter, and when. Holland's experience is valuable because it is not abstract. He knows that small islands can have local effects that do not match distant calculations. He knows how winds can hold water off a reef or push it in. At the command level, the urgent need is to keep the landing from stalling completely. Small adjustments are made. Some craft are directed toward the pier, where deeper water allows closer approach. The pier itself becomes a dangerous but useful landmark, dividing the landing beaches and offering a potential route for movement. The pier is not a solution. It is covered by fire. Men who try to use it are exposed. But it is one of the few structures that reaches into deeper water past the reef, and the fight forces commanders to consider every imperfect option. By late morning, the pattern repeats. More boats ground, more men wade, more craft are hit while waiting in the lagoon. Some attempts to land tanks are disrupted when the craft carrying them cannot clear the reef. When a tank does get ashore, it becomes a point of effort because it can give direct fire against bunkers, but it is never enough to make the beach suddenly safe. A calm description of the day must also include the human cost without decoration. Men are killed in the water. Men are wounded and cannot move fast enough to avoid being hit again. Wounded men crowd whatever cover exists at the seawall. The heat is intense and the coral reflects light upward. Water is short because much of what should have come in easily is delayed on the reef. Reports from the beach describe how quickly equipment is lost when men are forced to wade. A radio operator who loses his set does not lose only a piece of gear. He loses the ability to coordinate fire and movement. A machine gun dropped in salt water may not fire again. A demolition charge soaked at the wrong moment may fail. The reef strips capacity from the assault in small compounding losses. By midday, some of the initial assumptions are abandoned. Instead of expecting orderly reinforcement, leaders focus on getting any reinforcement through at all. Instead of tidy lines, the fight becomes a set of local struggles around strong points. Marines use shell holes and debris for cover because the terrain offers little else. The defenders' positions are reduced one by one, often at short range. The turning point on Tarawa is not a single dramatic command. It is the accumulation of improvised adjustments that keep the assault from breaking. More tracked amphibians are used as ferries despite damage. Small groups push along the beach to flank bunkers. Naval gunfire at times is brought closer in, risking friendly casualties, but attempting to break the strongest positions, the line inches forward. In this turning period, the tide is watched with a kind of practical hope. Not hope for a miracle, but hope for inches. If the water rises enough to float a few more boats over the reef, it can change the logistics of the fight. If it does not, the fight continues under the same strain. Major Holland's earlier insistence becomes part of how officers explain events to their own men. Shoup had already warned units that wading might be required. That warning does not make the experience easy, but it reduces the shock of the unexpected. In an assault, shock can paralyze. Expectation can keep men moving even when conditions are worse than hoped. As afternoon progresses, the beachhead becomes slightly deeper. A few positions fall, routes open for movement across the seawall. More Marines get off the open sand and into the sparse cover inland. The defenders continue to fight, and their prepared positions continue to exact casualties. But the initial worst condition, men trapped on the reef under direct fire, slowly becomes less universal as more troops make it to cover. The next stage of the day is defined by consequences that cannot be undone. The assault is now committed. Supplies are short, units are mixed. Officers and non-commissioned officers must rebuild control with what they can see and reach. Night will come, and the island will not be fully taken. The perimeter must be held with limited water and ammunition, with wounded men needing care, and with the possibility of counterattack. This is where technical failures show their most personal shape. A tide prediction error is not an error on a page. It is a platoon without its machine guns. It is a company that cannot bring ashore enough ammunition in time. It is a wounded man who cannot be evacuated because craft cannot cross the reef safely under fire. In the night, the lagoon remains a barrier. Some supplies arrive by effort and risk. Some craft continue to move when they can. The defenders still hold parts of the island. The fight becomes a sequence of close engagements, with Marines reducing bunkers and trenches in small increments. Tarawa's battle lasts days, not hours. Through it all, the reef remains present. Even when the tide does rise, it does not erase what happened earlier. It does not restore the radios lost to salt water. It does not bring back the men killed while wading. It simply makes later movement somewhat less impossible than it was in the first hours. When Betio is finally secured, the battlefield shows the shape of the problem in physical evidence. Damaged craft sit in the lagoon and on the reef edge. The pier area bears marks of concentrated fire. The beaches are strewn with wreckage and abandoned equipment. The lagoon holds bodies and debris that tides and currents move slowly along the reef line. After the fighting, commanders and staff officers attempt to account for what occurred. They do this not only to assign credit or blame, but to avoid repeating predictable failures. Tarawa is not treated as a simple victory. It is treated as a warning. The institutional response begins with questions that sound technical but carry moral weight. Why was the tidal information insufficient? Why was the risk known yet still accepted without a more robust mitigation? Why were there not more tracked amphibians available given the reef? Why were alternative landing methods not possible within the broader operational constraints? Some answers are uncomfortable because they involve trade-offs made knowingly. Senior planners were aware that the tide might not behave. They weighed surprise, timing, and naval risk against the uncertainty of water depth. They proceeded. When the tide did not cooperate, the cost was paid by the men in the water. Other answers involved the limits of intelligence and surveying in wartime. There was not a long peacetime record of local tidal behaviour available to the assault planners. Hydrographic data was not as detailed as it would become later in the war. Reconnaissance of reefs in the face of enemy defences was dangerous and limited. But those limits do not erase the fact that a local advisor had warned of a likely shortfall. This is where Major Frank Holland's role becomes a quiet part of the record. He did not command a regiment. He did not lead a celebrated charge. He offered knowledge that could have reduced a known hazard. His warning was recorded because it was simple, specific, and correct in its direction, even if exact numbers were uncertain. In the months that follow, the lessons of Tarawa are absorbed in practical ways. More emphasis is placed on hydrographic reconnaissance. The need for reliable beach and reef intelligence is elevated. Assault planners become less willing to treat reefs and tides as secondary details. The demand for specialised units that can deal with obstacles in the surf grows stronger. The war does not pause to allow perfect solutions, but later operations reflect an awareness sharpened by what happened at Tarawa. The use of amphibious tractors expands. Pre-assault reconnaissance and demolition capabilities are developed further as the campaign progresses. In planning, tidal and reef conditions are treated with increased seriousness because they have already shown what they can do. The story of a grounded landing craft under enemy guns can be told as a story of bravery alone. That would be incomplete. Bravery was present, and it mattered. But the craft grounded because water was missing. Water was missing because prediction and local reality did not match, and that mismatch had been anticipated by a man whose name does not usually appear in popular retellings. There is a tendency, after a battle, to remember only the visible acts: the men who fought at the seawall, the officers who directed attacks while wounded, the crews who brought ships close to shore to fire. Those acts deserve remembrance. But there is also a quieter category of service: the work of charting, measuring, warning, and insisting on practical constraints. It is not glamorous. It is often treated as pessimism when it is offered in advance. When it proves accurate, it is treated as hindsight, even when it was spoken plainly at the time. Major Holland's warning did not stop the operation. It did not change the order of battle. It did not create additional LVTs out of thin air. It did, however, push at least some leaders to acknowledge risk honestly. It helped shape expectations among assault troops who were told they might have to wade. That kind of honesty is not a small thing in war. The reef at Tarawa remains a physical fact, but it also becomes a kind of reference point. It reminds planners that amphibious warfare is not only about firepower and courage. It is also about depth, timing, and the stubbornness of geography. A beach can be only a few hundred yards away and still be unreachable in the way a plan assumes. In later years, historians and veterans describe Tarawa as a battle that forced hard learning. They speak about the low tide and the reef because those elements are inseparable from the casualty lists. They mention the local warning because it demonstrates how narrow the margin was between a manageable landing and a disaster measured in minutes. The engineer who warned about tides is not a single archetype. He is also the surveyor who works from incomplete charts. He is the staff officer who argues for a longer bombardment because it may save men on an exposed reef. He is the planner who calculates how many inches of water a boat needs and refuses to pretend that inches are trivial. At Tarawa, one of those men had a name, a rank, and a clear statement. The water might not be there. The landing craft that grounded under enemy guns is remembered in photographs and reports as wreckage. It is sometimes described as a simple mishap. In reality, it is the visible end of a chain of assumptions. It is what happens when a schedule meets a reef and finds that nature has not agreed to cooperate. When the battle ends, flags rise, and commanders tour the ruined island. There are moments of ceremony. There are moments of pshnt. Men look at the lagoon and understand what it costs to cross. In those moments, the warning about tides is no longer an argument. It is a fact that can be walked out to on the reef edge, measured with a boot and a glance, and remembered. Tarawa's legacy includes changes in procedure and procurement, but it also includes a lesson about who is heard. The war rewards decisiveness, but it also punishes the refusal to listen to technical reality. A reserve officer from New Zealand, valued for local knowledge, spoke with certainty that the water would be short. The system moved forward anyway, constrained by larger plans and confident in predictions that did not hold. The men in the first waves paid for that confidence in the lagoon. In the broader history of the war, Tarawa is one battle among many. In the specific history of amphibious operations, it stands as a reminder that success is often built on details that do not appear in dramatic summaries. A reef, a tide, a measured depth over coral, a warning offered early enough to matter. If this kind of overlooked wartime detail matters to you, consider subscribing to support more news stories about the people and technical choices history often leaves behind.